You take a young man with that kind of a privileged background and you throw him in a hole with rats and mice and flies and disease. Francis's world collapsed. It was just completely wiped out. Well, we think of St. Francis as the model of nonviolence and, living in a garden. We have him in our gardens and with fountains and birds and flowers. He wasn't always that way. Francis was a young son, privileged son of a very successful businessman in Assisi. And the custom in that world was that the young men would take on the policing or the protection of the village, of the commune. And so from a very early age, Francis was trained in warfare. He was trained to kill. He was trained to overcome enemies at close hand, hand-to-hand combat. We know that Francis was involved in at least 3 battles. The third one I would call is the battle at Collestrata, where the people, the inhabitants, the citizens of Assisi were fighting with the people in Perugia, about 25 miles away. And Francis, with his compatriots, the companions from the town of Assisi, they were all dressed up in their silks and their flags and their banners and their metal shields and their breastplate and helmets, and they were ready for a battle. And they go off to fight the people of the men of Perugia. And in a valley between the 2 communities, there was another, like a resting place. There was a castle there, Collestrata, and the people in Francis's troop got there, and all of a sudden they were ambushed. They were surrounded, and they were slaughtered. At that time, we're talking of around 1202, 1203. There were no prisons in Europe at the time, in Western Europe, because prisoners were very rare. You would either punish people by enslaving them and having them work in your fields if they were stealing chickens or a horse or something, or if they were violent, they were just executed. You weren't going to feed them. You were not going to take care of these people. And so at the time of Francis, there was not any, you have prisoners, but you didn't have a prison. And you weren't going to kill Francis and his other companions, the ones that were left alive, because these are really valuable people. These are valuable guys. And they thought, well, we got to keep them on hold until we can negotiate a financial settlement. They can be repatriated. What they probably did, we don't know for absolute certain, but we know that Francis was in prison for a whole year. And to be in prison at that time, it wasn't a building with bars and a lock and a jailer, but on the perimeter of the town square that was built on the side of the foothills of a mountain, of a large hill, the people would they would cut stone from around the outcropping underneath the town square, and they would use that stone then to build the buildings, the civic buildings in the area. And some people would get it they could buy stone to build your house and all that. Sometimes when it would rain, it would be too much, but it would be welcome because it would flush everything down to a lower level. Francis was in that place for a year. Now, we neglect this. We overlook this part of Francis's life in the storytelling. When I was a novice, we heard that Francis was in prison for a period of time, and then he came out of prison and he went back home, but he had a different yearning, and he had more of a spiritual experience, and he then left his old way and became Francis of Assisi in a spiritual way. Well, I think what happens, and we see this more and more now with the literature that we get on post-traumatic stress disorder. When someone like Francis, who was very privileged and very accustomed to the finest clothing, his father had a fabric importing business. So Francis was always dressed as a billboard to advertise all his father's finery. You take a young man with that kind of a privileged background and you throw him in a hole with rats and mice and flies and disease. Francis's world collapsed. It was just completely wiped out. And as he's in this hole with a few companions and other strange people he didn't know before, he's forced to think about, why in the world am I here? What happened? How did this happen? Who benefited from this thing? And I think then is when he began to have what we call a conversion. He went from his privileged world to being completely crushed and probably not feeling very well with fever and whatever he got, flu or tuberculosis or whatever diseases came upon him. And that is when he did what we would call an analysis on society, on culture. He was released and he went back home. But the thing is he was never able to really fit back into the family structure. I think that the experience of that year in what we would call a prison, of his being held captive for ransom, was a very, very destructive and very overwhelmingly powerful moment in the life of Francis of Assisi.